Recently, someone asked me, Pastor Mike, is the Apostle Paul saying in Romans chapter 1 that there's a spiritual aspect to sexual immorality? You following that line of thought? That our sexual choices are not just physical or relational, but they're deeply spiritual. And the answer, as I read Romans chapter 1, is an unqualified yes. You might know Romans chapter 1 is famous for tackling sexual sins. In particular, it's probably the clearest section that talks about homosexual behavior, in case that's of interest to you. But before Paul gets to that, he says this in Romans 1, verse 24. Therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. So God is letting them do what they want to do, which is commit sexual sin. Verse 25, here it is. These people exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served created things rather than the Creator who is forever praised. Wow, that is a fundamentally important verse to understand. Why did these people abandon God's rules for sex? Why do you and I? And Paul's answer is not a chemical thing, or we were in love, or one thing led to another. He doesn't blame it on culture and all the stuff that's on screens, or how the Romans are, or how the Greek, whatever. No, he says the reason we end up committing sexual sin is because we make a terribly not great exchange. We exchange truth for a lie, and we worship a created thing instead of the Creator God. When God says, I will satisfy your soul, but some created thing, a person, an image, sex, says, no, I'll satisfy your soul. God over here says, I'm the one who can fill you with happiness and joy. But sex over here says, no, this is the way you get filled with happiness and joy. Sometimes there's sin over here of a sexual nature or otherwise, and there's God over here, and you can only serve one of the two. You cannot have two masters. And what so often happens, and trust me, pornography has been a long part of my story. I was an addict for many years. What I would do every single time I clicked was to turn away from God and worship something in his place. Before my sexual immorality, there was idolatry. There was the loving of and trusting in something before I loved and trusted in my God. That's what Paul is saying. Why do we do these things? It's because we get our loves disordered. Years ago, someone said the first commandment is the first commandment for a very good reason. Because the only reason you break any of the other commandments is because you've broken the first commandment. You shall have no other gods, the first commandment says. Why do we dishonor our parents or others in authority? Because we worship the God of me and independence and autonomy. Why do we steal things or not give generously? Because we worship the God of money and all the stuff that it can get me, materialism. Why do we commit sexual sins? Because we worship the God of pleasure or companionship or romance or relationship. And so everything is spiritual. What I do with my money, what you do with your body, it is a deeply spiritual act that either says, I love God more than anything, or I don't. Your obedience to the sexual commands of the Bible, it's not a relationship thing. It's not a marriage thing. It's not a freedom thing. It's not a pleasure thing. It is a soul thing, a deeply spiritual thing. And so let me ask you a really direct question. Do you love God the most? If God, and I'm talking about the God who is so good, he loved you when you didn't deserve it. I'm talking about the God who is so great, he gave the only son he had to save you when you were his enemy. I'm talking about a God who sent his son, I'm talking about that God, not some bully God, not some super judgmental God. I'm talking about the kindest, most generous, forgiving, gracious God you can imagine. If that God said, here's how I want you to use your body, would you love him enough to obey it? Or would you love something more so that you disobey him? This is at the heart of every sexual choice that you and I make. Well, my friends, do not diminish your sexuality. It is an act of worship, either of God or of something else. I pray that you can meditate and dig deeply on Romans chapter 1 and see what the scriptures are saying to you, that our sex is always deeply spiritual.
Hey, thanks for listening to Taboo Questions with me, Pastor Mike Novotny. You can find even more questions on timeofgrace.org/taboo questions and in my book entitled Taboo, Topics Christians Should Be Talking About But Don't. Just look for the link in the episode notes.